let's be clear. I mean, these people don't want to face the facts.
Joining me for the Q&A this evening is Ronald Goldman, who you might have seen in the film. Ronald Goldman is the head of the Circumcision Resource Center. He's a psychologist, he's an author, and he also has written about questioning circumcision from a Jewish perspective. So let's give a round of applause for Dr. Ronald Goldman. I think he may also have copies of his books, if you're curious to get one of those.
I just happen to have a few.
Just a few, okay, good. I also learned we don't have mics tonight, so please project if you're asking a question, and I'll try to do the same. So, oh, and by the way, we are filming the Q&A, so just FYI, that will be on camera. So, does anyone have any questions? In the back there.
I was surprised that when they talked about the masturbation issue in this country, Kellogg never came up.
So,
I was a big proponent, and that's one of the reasons I think we still have what we have as far as the push in this country for circumcision.
So for those that don't know, one of the early proponents of circumcision in America was Harvey Kellogg, who was a founder of Kellogg's Corn Flakes. He was one of the inventors of that. When I interviewed Dr. Leonard Glick, who's the historian who appears in the film, he said that Kellogg was not as significant a part of that being pushed in America as a lot of activists make him out to be. Even though he was a proponent, he wasn't as key an instigator. And so that was something where I think that that's interesting, but talking about that aspect, that's sort of an idea that's only familiar to people who are already familiar with this issue. And I decided to focus mainly on the reasons it was pushed, which was as a quote unquote cure for masturbation.
Thank you.
Yeah. I'm sure you guys are in quite a state after seeing that, so I fully appreciate if it takes a minute for the questions to come. Up front here.
So why did you yourself feel that it was necessary to take the initiative to produce this film?
My background is as a filmmaker. I've wanted to make films since I was 14. I went to film school. It's what I was doing professionally when I discovered this issue. And when I discovered it and had the obsessive epiphany, which was what John Geisinger calls it, I needed to move that energy in some way. I had a lot of emotions about it. I had a lot of grief. And one of the things I've read is that men heal differently than women. Women tend to do better with talk therapy, and men tend to want to do something with the feelings they have. And so for me, the thing that I do is filmmaking. It's the thing that I use to express the things I have trouble talking about. And that was how I chose to move that energy. So it's also because, one of the things that came up at our Washington, D.C. screening was people were asking, well, what can I do? And I feel like you should do the thing that's in your zone of genius. And for me, I feel like the thing that I'm good at is taking large amounts of information and condensing it into media of some kind. So I was going to do something, and filmmaking is what I do and what I love doing. So that became this film. You might actually be able to speak more on some of the psychological stuff that men face on this in terms of how men heal around this issue, because there's not a lot of resources for men.
Sure. This is a trauma. And my primary book is called Circumcision, the Hidden Trauma. And the trauma is an overwhelmingly painful experience. And we tend not to be very sensitive to infants' feelings because we don't remember what it's like to be an infant. And it's a lot more comfortable for us as adults to deny that we're causing any pain, let alone trauma, to an infant. So this trauma has various aspects. And one of the most serious ones, it disrupts the relationship between the child and the mother. That is very serious. That is our primary relationship. Of course, we grow and develop inside our mothers. There's a connection and relationship before birth. So for a child to go through a circumcision, the child learns instinctively he cannot trust his mother to take care of him. He doesn't feel safe with his mother. His mother is not sensitive to how he feels. She's allowed this to happen. So he has to repress those feelings. Sometimes infants withdraw in shock. Now, when one represses feelings, it has a general effect, as I said briefly in the film. That means we're insensitive to a lot of feelings, not just the ones about circumcision, because we need these defenses to keep the circumcision horrible feelings repressed. So we grow up as men who are circumcised, generally, having less sensitivity to our feelings, because those defenses are there holding back the traumatic feelings. And when we're less sensitive to our feelings, we're less sensitive to others' feelings. Reduces our empathy. And there was a preliminary research study on this, studying the feeling sensitivity of men who are circumcised compared to men who are not circumcised. And they found a significant increase in insensitivity for men who are circumcised. And it makes sense psychologically. It even makes sense instinctively. How can we survive this kind of thing without repressing our feelings? And then that's going to have a generalized effect on us as human beings being sensitive or insensitive to others. So we have a cultural problem here. We have a cultural trauma. And generally speaking, you know, there's all parts of the spectrum here in terms of human sensitivity. But generally speaking, we tend to be less sensitive to the feelings of others in this country than, you know, say the European countries, where they're taking care of each other a lot better than we tend to take care of each other here. Here, we tend to be more competitive. We tend to be thinking about our own welfare and what's in it for us, rather than how can we provide for the general good, the common good. So, you know, again, there's very little study about this, because in this country, we want to find a study that shows a benefit for circumcision. That's the study that gets the funding. That's the study that gets the media attention. And the study is to look for the negative effects. You know, who's going to pay for that? So we do the best we can based on our resources, but it's very difficult. On the other hand, do we need a study to find out whether we should be doing this or not? Just watch a video and trust your gut, trust your feelings, trust your common sense. Mothers, trust your maternal instinct. It isn't that difficult.
Can men heal from this, from that trauma you said?
To varying degrees. And I think the most effective therapy is experiential therapy. No talk, in my opinion, no talk therapy. It can be a little bit of help, but it isn't going to be a significant, because we're talking about emotional problems here. The repression and the insensitivity, and feelings don't change from talking. I mean, we can understand, but somebody said once, understanding is the booby prize. We really need to get back to our feelings, our natural feelings. We were born to have feelings. Infants have more feelings, more sensitive to their feelings than adults are. And in order to survive in adult culture, they tend to get defended. And that's how we survive in a relatively insensitive cultural environment. So have I answered your question? Yeah. So experiential therapies can be very effective in helping us. Actually, people have relived circumcision, discharged the feelings that have been repressed, and feel a sense of relief and more emotionally sensitive going on from there. But it's a process. It isn't going to happen in one session.
Having interviewed a lot of people who've done work around this issue, I agree. The somatic therapies, the nonverbal therapies, you might call them, tend to be much more effective. Questions? So I hand up front here.
What do you think about the psychology behind the doctors who are able to do this day in and day out?
Okay, doctors are trained to do this. People that choose to become doctors tend to be very focused on intellectual experience, understanding. You know, it's up here with them. And when you experience most of your life in your head, obviously you're not feeling as much as you otherwise might. But again, certain personality types are attracted to medicine. Like other personality types are attracted to social work or to being a lawyer. So again, and historically it's been mostly men who have been doctors. And most of those men were circumcised. Okay, and men who are circumcised tend to support it because they're repressing their own feelings of the tremendous harm and emotional pain that they experience. So there is research in the psychological literature that shows that there is a compulsion to repeat trauma on the next generation. And another example of this would be child abuse. So for example, if one was abused as a child, in whatever manner, if you were abused as a child, you're more likely to abuse your children should you become a parent later in life. So there's again, a relationship, a connection, a compulsion to pass on the trauma. So people in medicine, the way they're passing on the trauma is they're not providing true information to the parents who are signing this form. If you read a consent form, it says that I have been informed of the presumed benefits, risks, disadvantages, alternatives to this circumcision, which I may sign here. Anyone who signs that has lied or isn't aware, to be more accurately, is not aware. They don't know what they don't know. Okay? And just as an aside, I decided to file a bill here in Massachusetts requiring informed consent for true informed consent, not supposed informed consent. And I identified about 8 facts that I backed up with references to the literature that parents should be aware of before they're asked if they want to sign a consent form. And guess what? The bill was killed in committee, which all bills have to go through a committee before they get presented to the legislature for general debate and vote. So it never got beyond the committee.
Was that recent?
That was what?
Was that recent that you did that?
It was in the last year, yeah.
Wow.
Was there a reason?
Okay, I want to mention one other thing here I think is very important. That is that Medicaid, that's health care for the poor, funded by taxpayers, pays for circumcisions in most of the states in this country. And Medicaid regulations and federal and state regulations require that Medicaid payments be only for medically necessary services. That's a direct quote. Must be medically necessary, okay? And nobody in the world, even the guys in the film, they do not say that circumcision is medically necessary. I mean, let's be clear. Aside from Americans, Muslims, and Jews, only about 5% of the world circumcises. Okay, most people think it's horrible. When they find out Americans do it, they're shocked. Okay, so again, our tax dollars are paying for medically unnecessary circumcisions, which are violating the regulations. So I make the argument, and I'm in the process of doing that. I'm taking it all the way. Whoever has any influence here, they're going to hear from me. They have or they will. Okay, so, and I'm keeping the focus on the regulations. I'm not getting into the merits of circumcision. I'm just saying, is this an agreement with the regulations or not? And if it isn't, then we shouldn't be paying for it. And, so far, quite a few people in government have either not responded or denied. What they do is they'll quote the American Academy of Pediatrics, which is beside the point, because they don't even recommend the practice, let alone say it's medically necessary. So there's a lot of denial here, avoiding truth. Let's be clear. I mean, these people don't want to face the facts, okay? But we need to keep the pressure on and increase the pressure, and we will win.
How are doctors getting away with doing a procedure that's getting paid for by the government?
Well, again, it's culturally accepted. I mean, they couldn't go to France and do it.
The question was, how is it that doctors are performing a procedure that isn't medically necessary and getting funding for it?
Well, again, we got something that's embedded in the culture. We have something that people in positions of influence are very reluctant to stand up and say, hey, I think this is wrong. We have people who are more interested in self-interest than in the public interest. It's very common and very serious. We have people who lack courage. And so we just have to make it more obvious to them that this is okay. I want to mention one other thing here I think is very important. That is that Medicaid, that's health care for the poor, funded by taxpayers, pays for circumcisions in most of the states in this country. And Medicaid regulations and federal and state regulations require that Medicaid payments be only for medically necessary services. That's a direct quote. Must be medically necessary, okay? And nobody in the world, even the guys in the film, they do not say that circumcision is medically necessary. I mean, let's be clear. Aside from Americans, Muslims, and Jews, only about 5% of the world circumcises, okay? Most people think it's horrible. When they find out Americans do it, they're shocked. Okay, so again, our tax dollars are paying for medically unnecessary circumcisions, which are violating the regulations. So I make the argument, and I'm in the process of doing that. I'm taking it all the way. Whoever has any influence here, they're going to hear from me. They have or they will. Okay, so, and I'm keeping the focus on the regulations. I'm not getting into the merits of circumcision. I'm just saying, is this an agreement with the regulations or not? And if it isn't, then we shouldn't be paying for it. And so far, quite a few people in government have either not responded or denied. What they do is they'll quote the American Academy of Pediatrics, which is beside the point, because they don't even recommend the practice, let alone say it's medically necessary. So there's a lot of denial here. Avoiding truth. Let's be clear. I mean, these people don't want to face the facts, okay? But we need to keep the pressure on and increase the pressure, and we will win. It's going to affect you if you keep lying about this or if you keep quiet about this, because we're not going away.
But it's become big business.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
The removed, the foreskin that's removed is not disposed of. It's sold to somebody else.
Did you hear that?
Yeah, so the comment was that the foreskin is often sold, which is true. Very often the foreskin tissue is sold to biomedical companies. It's sold to companies that use it in commercial products. And obviously there's ethical issues with using tissue from someone who did not consent to give it. And there's also a large financial industry in that, because not only do they make the money on the circumcision, but they also make the money selling those foreskins later. So, someone asked earlier about how the doctors are able to do this. And there's an earlier interview that I ended up not having space for in the film with Dr. Paul Fleiss, who was a doctor who did thousands of circumcisions, and said it wasn't until later he heard the cry of the baby doing one. And the moment he heard that, he stopped and he couldn't do it anymore. And doctors are bombarded with information during medical school. It's so much information that their internal gut feeling sometimes gets pushed aside because there's so much to get done. And they have large authority figures around them who are grading them, who are determining whether or not they'll make it through this multi-year process that they're investing thousands of dollars and hundreds of hours into, who are telling them this is what you should do. And authority and social proof are huge, powerful persuasion factors. So stopping to feel your feelings in that environment is very difficult. And I feel like one of the huge conflicts or themes in the film isn't necessarily between pro-circumcision and anti-circumcision, although that's there, but between people who are willing to stop and feel their feelings and people who aren't. And doctors who are able to pause and feel those feelings often have a change of perspective on circumcision. Question in the back there.
I want to know how you talk to Dr. Schoen and Brian Morris and got them to be in this film, and did they have any reservations that somehow the way they would be represented might reflect badly on their beliefs? Or did they worry that your film might be a pro-circumcision or pro-anti-circumcision, I'm sorry, pro-intactivist film?
So they were very eager to debate the intactivists, actually. They were wanting to put their perspective out there and combat their opposition. And so it was the challenge of interviewing them was one more so of timing. Brian Morris is in Australia, and I can actually share a little bit of the story of how that interview happened. I emailed him and said, we're doing this film. I'd love to interview you. Is there any time you'll be in the United States? I'll travel and meet you there. And there was a conference in Hawaii he was going to be at in 2 weeks. So I was living in California, and a $300 plane ticket was a lot cheaper than a $1,400 plane ticket. And that's, so the timing was actually the harder part. But I also think each of them wants to be seen as an expert and have their authority and prestige validated. And setting up a camera and featuring them in a documentary is one way to do that. So, when you get into the psychology of each person involved in this issue, it may look like there's this, rational, scientific, but the decisions being made that most people make are actually much more emotional. And so for them, they have an aspect that wants to be seen as an authority figure, that wants to speak on this issue, and then also a part of them that really wants to combat and debate the intactivists. And so they were actually very eager. And in fact, when I interviewed Brian Morris, one of the questions I always ask an interview subject is there anything that I didn't ask you that you think we should talk about? And sometimes that'll lead to some idea that I totally would never have thought of, and we go for another 30 minutes talking about that. And in his case, he said, well, yeah, the intactivists say this thing, and I want to combat that point. So he actually wanted to go through all of the points that intactivists make and give his 2 cents on them and debate them.
I have a comment to
Sure.
add to that. What circumcision advocates generally do is they avoid direct debate. There's a difference between, being in a room with, a filmmaker and expressing one's point of view, as opposed to being in a room with someone with an opposing point of view who can rebut what you just said. And I have particular experience with this. In 1999, after that year's circumcision policy statement by the American Academy of Pediatrics, the chairperson of that task force was invited by NPR to debate with me, and she refused. Okay, then in 2012, the chairperson of the policy statement from the American Academy of Pediatrics was invited to debate with me by the Wall Street Journal, and that chairperson refused. So on the one hand, you think, well, gee, if these people are, have a point of view about circumcision and have a chance to be in national media and get their point of view out, that I would think they would want to do that. But they don't want to do that when there's an opponent who is knowledgeable, who can criticize what they have to say. They don't want any part of that. And so when there's no open debate, there's no scientific process.
With that, to go along with that, I believe I recall seeing on the Circumcision Resource Center's Facebook page a while ago, were you the one who asked someone from the World Health Organization about functions of the foreskin, that David Tomlinson, at a...
I'm the guy. I went to his presentation at, I think it was Brigham and Women's Hospital. I went there specifically for that purpose of it. I quote him all the time. It's a great line to use because sometimes people in various positions refer to the World Health Organization, and he's the so-called circumcision expert for the World Health Organization. And I quote him saying he doesn't know the functions of the foreskin. So how can you trust a guy to, be the lead person on circumcision for that organization? Thank you.
All the way in the back.
There was a study on that. The study involved a survey of women who had sexual experience with men who were and were not circumcised. And the bottom line, the results of the study is that the women preferred the men who were not circumcised by a ratio of 6 to 1.
I think it's also largely cultural. So part of the reason I included Flamby, who's the woman who is sort of pro-FGM in the film, is because that's something that I think most Americans would feel that every woman who's experienced that feels that they're traumatized and their human rights were violated. And most of the women in those cultures don't. And I don't think that any particular person has to feel a certain way about this issue, especially about their own body. And I would never tell anyone else how they should feel. But there's going to be a certain number of men who do feel that way. And so the argument that intactivists are making is that men should have that choice. And in American culture, we have created a stigma around the foreskin. So most people don't see one over the course of their life, especially if you're a man and you're straight, you're not going to have any comparative experience of any kind. And think about how many misconceptions about sexuality you might have had as a kid. Like just complete, things that were totally wrong. And most of those get dispelled either through personal experience or someone tells you. There's someone who actually gives you different information. And in the case of this, most people don't have any comparative experience, and our wider culture does not provide information on it. And so people carry the myths that they have about the intact male body throughout their life. And in the cultures that practice female circumcision, you see similar myths. So Soraya Mirey, who helped pass the 1996 law against FGM, she wrote a book called The Girl with Three Legs, because in her culture, she's from Somalia, that's what they call a woman who still has her clitoris. It's the third leg. And they say if a man's penis touches it, it'll fall off. And of course, we look at that and we think, that's completely insane. But our culture has similar myths. And so I think a lot of the attitudes that women have about the foreskin are similarly culturally informed, not necessarily informed by any kind of experience with that body part. And the other studies I've seen is that women tend to prefer what their partner has. That attraction is a lot more than just like what's below the belt. And women will accept all sorts of crazy body types that men have if they actually like the guy. And so if, and I see this from the friends of mine who are intact, it comes down to the responses they get from women come down a lot to how they carry themselves and the attitude they have. And sometimes they'll meet a girl who has no experience with that, and she'll warm up to it because she likes him. So I feel like when it comes to that, if your son has a really strong sense of himself and self-confidence, no matter what sort of body shaming someone throws at him, he'll be okay. That's my thought there.
And isn't it also true that these days about half and half boys are circumcised?
Right. That's the other thing, is that many of the people who I hear say that come from a generation when 90% of men were circumcised. And so there was just like a few people who had that differently. Now it's 50-50. And so the women that a son born today, the women that he's going to be interested in are going to come from a generation where at least half the guys that they meet still have their body intact. And so it's not going to be as strange a thing. And I feel like the attitude that, oh, he's going to be teased for it, it usually comes from older people who come from a generation where that was the cultural norm. Yeah, and it was very common then that was seen as a weird thing. And the culture has shifted now. And so I feel like when it comes to those cultural considerations, you have to think about not what was the experience growing up, but what is the world going to be like 10 years from now when he's having those experiences. And I think it'll be very different. I mean, just think about how much the world's changed in the past 10 years, right? In terms of all sorts of attitudes about sexuality and culture and personal autonomy. 10 years from now, it could be very different.
I want to add a couple of things. One, in terms of the rates vary significantly depending on what state or what region in the country. And out west, there are a few states that have circumcision rates below 25%. Another point, in terms of growing up and being in the minority in the process of doing research for writing my book, I talked to a few boys, and one boy in particular was the only one in his class who was not circumcised. And he felt fine about himself and sorry for all the other boys who were circumcised. Now, why was that? Because when he was about 5 years old, he had a conversation with his mother, and she explained to him why he was not circumcised and why he's likely to come across boys who are. And when he heard that, he said, "Oh, wow, that was horrible. I mean, to do that to these boys. Nobody's going to do that to me." And when he said that, he put his hands over his genitals, as if protecting himself from the possibility that could happen. So the point is here that how a boy feels about this, it often connected with, having a conversation about this, which is important because, children should know what the differences are and what they're all about. So again, he was the only one in his class. He felt fine about himself, sorry for his peers.
So we have to wrap up here in the next couple minutes. Thank you everyone for coming.